Okay, let's unpack this. We've got a source today that dives deep into, well, what makes us tick.
Hmm.
It's pulling insights from Robert Wright's book, The Moral Animal. Pretty fascinating stuff.
It really is. It tackles human nature through the lens of evolutionary psychology.
And this deep dive is really for you, the learner, to get a handle on how our ancient evolutionary past might still be shaping us today,
Mhm.
sometimes in ways you wouldn't expect, maybe even a bit uncomfortable.
That's right. For a long time, the standard view was, human behavior is mostly culture, learning, thinking, separate from animal instinct.
Right, like Darwin applies to birds and bees, but not really to us complex humans.
Pretty much. People thought applying natural selection to things like love or marriage or even friendship was, bit of a stretch.
But then evolutionary psychology really came onto the scene, maybe late 20th century.
Exactly. And it started merging Darwin's ideas with social science. It proposed that the relentless pressure for genes to replicate over millions of years has actually sculpted our minds.
So our feelings, our biases, who we're attracted to, the source argues these are evolved tools.
Evolved mechanisms, yeah. Things that, historically anyway, nudged our ancestors toward behaviors that helped them pass on their genes.
And the book looks at a whole range of things, right? Mating, family, friendship, status, even how we see ourselves.
It does. All through this evolutionary lens, it even connects it to Darwin's own life, suggesting his experiences sort of illustrate his own theories.
Okay, so for this deep dive, we're focusing on the first chunk of the summary you shared. The mission is to pull out the key ideas about how evolution shaped our core relationships: love, marriage, kinship.
And maybe push a little into friendship, status, and self-perception, too, where the summary starts to lead.
So we're looking at those maybe hidden unconscious influences from natural selection, asking things like, why do we fall for certain people?
Hmm. And why is monogamy so common if, there might be a male impulse for variety?
And what about family, that feeling of selfless love? Is there an evolutionary logic there too?
It's about uncovering that biological history that might still be whispering to us underneath all the culture and conscious thought.
Okay, let's jump in, starting with the evolutionary logic of love and mating.
Right. And this is where it gets, as you said, potentially provocative.
Yeah, because from a purely genetic view, love is, well, it's linked to procreation, isn't it?
At its root, yes. All those intense feelings, anxiety, happiness, jealousy, pain, they're framed as psychological tools, forged by evolution,
Tools to motivate us.
to motivate behaviors that historically upped the chances of getting genes into the next generation.
And this pressure shapes male and female preferences differently. Let's start with male preferences, according to the source: youth, appearance, fidelity.
Those are the key ones highlighted.
Youth seems kind of obvious, maybe, evolutionarily speaking.
The logic is pretty direct. Female fertility isn't unlimited. It peaks, then declines. So a younger mate historically meant a longer potential reproductive window.
More time, more chances for offspring.
Exactly. If a male ancestor was drawn to older partners, his genes likely wouldn't spread as effectively as a rival drawn to younger, more fertile mates. Over time, that preference for youth gets selected for.
Makes sense. And appearance, how does that link up?
The source connects it tightly to judging youth. Think about the ancestral environment turn. No driver's licenses, right?
Right. No proof of age.
So physical appearance, things we often call beauty, smooth skin, clear eyes, certain facial proportions, they could serve as imperfect cues, indicators of youth and health.
Imperfect, but maybe better than nothing.
Potentially. Males who were subconsciously better at picking up these cues might have had more reproductive success. Those who were bad at it maybe chose less fertile partners, might have left fewer descendants.
So our idea of beauty might have roots in assessing fertility.
That's the argument. It wasn't just aesthetics, it was potentially a proxy for reproductive value. But, and this is crucial,
Yeah.
for a long-term partner, the source says fidelity is often more important than youth or looks.
Okay, why fidelity? Why is that paramount for long term?
It comes down to parental investment. Raising kids takes huge resources. Time, food, protection, teaching. It's costly.
Right.
Now, if a male invests all that in a child that, well, isn't genetically his because his mate was unfaithful, that's a massive evolutionary loss.
He's wasting his effort, genetically speaking. making clothes for someone else, as the source put it.
Exactly, a devastating genetic dead end for that line of investment.
So evolution would strongly favor males who could minimize that risk, which means assessing fidelity becomes critical.
Absolutely critical. The source suggests males might be sensitive to behavioral cues, things like perceived reluctance versus ease about sex, historically may be seen as unreliable signals about future faithfulness.
And the virginity complex in some cultures.
Presented as a cultural outcome of his deep male concern about paternity certainty, even the way men might distinguish between what they want in a short-term fling versus a long-term wife. That could be a filtering mechanism, prioritizing signals of fidelity for the wife.
Okay, clear picture for male pressures. Youth beauty for fertility cues, fidelity for ensuring investment pays off genetically. What about female preferences? The source stresses the different reproductive cost.
It's a huge difference. Male minimum investment can be tiny. Female minimum is enormous. Pregnancy, childbirth, nursing, years of dependency,
The stakes are much higher for her choice.
much higher. A poor choice has a far bigger negative impact on her lifetime reproductive success than a poor choice does for a male. So females evolve to be more discerning, more conservative in mate choice.
Given those high stakes, what are females prioritizing evolutionarily?
The source points to two big things: good genes and resources. Appearance can signal health, genetic quality, sure, but resources are often presented as even more critical from the female perspective.
Which explains why the source calls female preference for wealth legitimate and rational in this view.
Precisely. Material resources, food, shelter, safety, directly boost offspring survival. And not just survival, but future competitiveness. Kids with more resources might be healthier, better positioned to find their own mates later.
So it's about maximizing the chances for her genes down the line.
Exactly. Prioritizing a partner with resources is, in this framework, investing in the survival and success of her offspring, maximizing her genetic legacy.
But resources aren't the whole story. Commitment and reliability are also key.
Absolutely vital. A male might have resources, but if he's not committed, if he has that wandering eye and isn't devoted, those resources might get diverted elsewhere to other females, other offspring.
So she needs assurance his investment stays with her and their kids.
That's crucial. A responsible, committed partner signals that assurance. It ensures his time, protection, and resources benefit their shared genetic future.
This difference in costs and priorities really seems to explain that study about how men and women react differently to infidelity.
It provides a strong evolutionary rationale for it, yeah. The classic thought experiment. What upsets you more? Sexual infidelity or emotional infidelity?
And for men, the source says it's the sexual act.
Overwhelmingly, yes. Higher anxiety, stronger physiological response. Because that's the direct threat to paternity certainty. If she sleeps with someone else, the child might not be his. Emotional connection without sex is less of a direct genetic threat to him.
And for women, it flips.
Exactly the opposite. Higher stress imagining him forming a deep emotional bond with someone else. Her primary threat isn't not knowing if the child is hers, she knows. It's the potential loss of his resources. His time, support, commitment, diverted to another woman and her kids.
Emotional attachment signals that resource diversion is likely.
Right. A purely sexual fling without emotional involvement, while maybe upsetting for other reasons, historically posed less of a direct threat to her and her offspring's resource security than is falling in love with someone else.
It's striking how these biological differences manifest as different emotional triggers. But, like the source says, we're not consciously calculating this stuff, we just feel.
That's the crucial overlay. We're driven by emotions shaped by evolution. The source uses Darwin's own notes about his anxiety before marriage. Maybe his apprehension about limiting future options was, like, an echo of that ancient male impulse, felt as anxiety, not calculated as lost genetic opportunity.
Our emotions are the compass.
An evolved compass, guiding us towards behaviors that were, on average, advantageous in our ancestral past.
So, wrapping up this point, evolutionary logic suggests these common patterns, male focus on fertility cues and fidelity, female focus on genes, resources, and commitment, have deep biological roots. Not the whole story is love, but a powerful underlying foundation.
It gives us a framework for understanding why these patterns show up so consistently across cultures.
Okay, let's tackle the next puzzle, monogamy. If there's this male evolutionary impulse towards, let's say, variety, why is monogamy the main system, often legally enforced? The source argues it's actually good for most men.
Yeah, it seems backwards at first, doesn't it? If maximizing gene copies is the goal, shouldn't males want unlimited partners?
That's the individual maximum potential, maybe?
Right, but then reality bites. Think about a society with widespread, unchecked polygyny, like the source describes. The top guys, wealthiest, strongest, highest status, they'd monopolize the most desirable women.
The tens take the tens, nines, and eights.
Exactly. And the nines take the sevens. By the time you get down the ladder, there's a whole lot of men left with
A
nobody.
large pool of mateless men.
A very large pool. And the source argues this creates huge social instability.
How so?
Men with no prospect of reproducing legitimately might turn to desperate measures. Violence to cut women, crime to get resources needed to attract women. You potentially see higher rates of unrest, theft, assault.
And that chaos eventually threatens even the guys at the top.
That's the argument. Even the elite males who benefit most directly from polygyny aren't safe in a society full of desperate, potentially violent single men. Their own wealth, status, even lives are at risk from the instability their monopoly helps create.
There's a tipping point where the risk outweighs the reward of more partners.
Potentially, yes, from a societal stability perspective.
What about women? The source mentions some might prefer sharing a high-status male over having a lower-status one exclusively.
That's acknowledged as a possibility. A woman might calculate subconsciously that being wife, #3 to a very high-value male, gives her offspring better genetic and resource prospects than being the sole wife of a much lower-value male.
But the overall argument is that the downsides outweigh this.
The argument leans towards the massive disadvantage for most men and the resulting social chaos being a stronger evolutionary pressure overall, pushing towards systems that distribute mates more evenly.
So monogamy, while limiting the top male's potential, drastically increases the number of average guys who get to reproduce.
That's the core evolutionary argument for it benefiting most men. It leads to a more equitable distribution of partners. Less intense competition among the masses of men means less social tension, potentially less crime, a more stable society.
So monogamy isn't just a moral rule, it's a system that may be offered evolutionary advantages for group stability and wider male reproductive success.
That's the perspective offered. A sort of social contract rooted in evolutionary pressures benefiting the majority and promoting stability, which helps everyone, especially in raising offspring.
Interesting trade-off. But the source also mentions de facto polygyny still exists.
Yeah, through serial monogamy. A man marries, has kids during her prime fertility, divorces, remarries someone younger, maybe repeats. He's essentially monopolizing the reproductive years of multiple women over his lifetime.
Which limits the pool for other men.
Effectively, yes. The source argues it functions similarly to polygyny in reducing opportunities for other males.
And the source links family structure to child outcomes, evolutionarily speaking.
Yes, emphasizing that from a gene-centric view, kids raised by both biological parents typically get a higher total investment. Not just stuff, but time, knowledge, connections, all aimed at boosting their chances of survival and future reproduction.
Because both parents are directly invested in that child's genetic future.
50% shared genes each. That creates a powerful incentive for investment.
And step-parent situations. The source sounds pretty stark.
The data and the evolutionary logic presented are, quite sobering. Statistically, children with step-parents face higher risks of abuse, neglect, even infanticide. The evolutionary reasoning is blunt. The stepchild doesn't carry the step-parent's genes.
So the investment incentive is lower or even absent.
The direct genetic incentive is absent. Now, of course, many step-parents form strong, loving bonds. The source notes maybe adopting very young infants is different. The bond forms during total dependency. But the general statistical pattern and the underlying evolutionary logic point to reduced investment and protection because there's no direct genetic payoff for the step-parent. And the older the child, the less likely that bond might mimic a biological one.
What about single parents?
Less risk than the step-parent scenario, but potentially fewer total resources, time, money, attention compared to two committed biological parents pooling their investment.
Okay, so wrapping up monogamy. The argument is it benefits the majority of men by spreading mating opportunities, fostering social stability, which in turn helps child rearing, especially when compared to widespread polygyny or less stable structures involving step-parents, all viewed through that evolutionary lens of gene propagation.
It frames monogamy as having these deep, evolved roots tied to individual success for the many and societal stability.
All right, we've looked at love, mating, marriage, relationships tied closely to reproduction and direct genetic links. Now, the source says things get really interesting as we broaden out to friends, rivals, society.
Right. The idea is that a lot of human evolution became less about fighting nature and more about navigating complex social worlds, competing within our own species.
So many of our psychological traits are adaptations for that social game.
That's the thrust, which brings us to section 4 in the summary. Friendship. The core idea. It's basically about reciprocal exchange. Give and take.
Not just warm feelings, but mutual benefit.
Fundamentally, yes. Friendships are seen as evolved cooperation strategies. They give you an edge in social competition, survival. But the key isn't just training equal things. It's about the value increase based on need.
Like the meat example worth more in the wild than at the store.
Perfect analogy. Helping someone when they're truly down, sending charcoal in snow that help is incredibly valuable, much more than helping someone already doing well, adding flowers to embroidery. Exchanging favors lets you trade something you have plenty of, low value to you now, for something you desperately need later, high value then, when your friend helps you out. It smooths life's bumps.
Beyond material stuff, information is key too.
Hugely important and cheap to share. Think ancestral environment. Where's the water? Is that berry poisonous? Who cheated who? Vital info for survival and social navigation?
Even modern gossip fits.
The source argues it does. Modern IG often hits those same themes. Success, failure, who's up, who's down, loyalty, betrayal, who can you trust? Sharing this helps us map the social landscape. Avoid risks.
Gossip is social risk management. I like that.
And skills, too. Teaching someone something useful, collaborating on a big task like hunting. It's all information and resource exchange that benefits both parties.
How do we keep track of all this give and take? The source says gratitude is the calculation tool.
Yeah, gratitude is framed as this evolved emotional mechanism. It gauges the value of the help received, how much it potentially boosted your survival or reproductive prospects. Stronger gratitude means higher value, stronger sense of obligation to pay it back. It's like an internal IOU system.
Keeps the social ledger balanced. But what if someone doesn't pay back? The tit-for-tat strategy comes in.
Right, dealing with freeloaders or, nah, we have evolved responses. Anger, resentment, these feelings motivate us to stop cooperating with that person, cutting our losses. The basic strategy is cooperate first, then mirror their last move. They help, they cheat, you stop helping.
Encourages cooperation, punishes cheating.
But it also allows for forgiveness if the cheater makes amends, maybe driven by guilt, because having a good reputation is valuable for future cooperation.
Which ties into trust and suspicion.
Essential tools. Trust lets us lower our guard, cooperate efficiently. Suspicion makes us cautious, helps us assess the risk of being exploited. It's a constant calibration.
And reputation is like social currency.
Exactly. A good reputation as trustworthy attracts more partners for cooperation, more opportunities. Spreading good words about reliable people rewards them and reinforces the whole system.
So why does betrayal happen if cooperation and reputation are so good?
The source frames it as a usually subconscious cost-benefit analysis. Betrayal happens when the immediate gain from cheating seems bigger than the long-term cost of a damaged reputation and lost future cooperation. Short-term temptation wins out.
Makes betrayal a constant possibility.
A persistent part of the social landscape, yes, which leads to this idea of a balance.
Between good guys and cheaters.
Yeah, like an equilibrium. Too many cheaters, everyone becomes distrustful, hard to cheat. Too few cheaters, the rewards for cheating are high, encourages more cheating. Society might settle into a mix, like the source's analogy of chefs and diners.
And again, we're not doing these calculations consciously. It's feelings.
That's the core message. Gratitude, anger, trust, suspicion, these are the evolved programs guiding us. Following these feelings, the source suggests, often points us towards what was ancestrally beneficial for gene propagation. The satisfaction of friendship, the sting of betrayal, they're guiding signals.
So friendship, an evolved system of reciprocal exchange, managed by emotions like gratitude, strategies like tit-for-tat, balancing trust and suspicion, explaining both cooperation and betrayal.
Pretty much sums up the evolutionary perspective on it, moving beyond just kin.
Right now, Section 5, the drive for social status. The source says hierarchy is basically universal.
Seems to be. Anthropology finds stratification everywhere, even in groups that look egalitarian, like that hunter-gatherer example. The best hunters get subtle perks, more resources, better mating chances. Even kids form pecking orders.
Why is status so critical, evolutionarily?
Because status usually translates directly into better reproductive prospects. Higher status often means more resources, better food, safety, and crucially, especially for males, it means more mating opportunities.
Like that Moroccan king example, 800 kids.
In extreme case, sure, but it illustrates the massive potential reproductive payoff of very high male status in certain systems. Even small bumps in status could historically mean a better chance of finding a mate, or multiple mates, or resources to raise kids successfully.
So the drive for status is really a drive for reproductive advantage.
That's the fundamental argument. Low status often correlates with poor mating success. The lowest often don't reproduce at all. So while staying low might be safe from rivals, the genetic imperative pushes us to compete. This leads to what the source calls ambition, adventurousness, a willingness to take risks, pay costs, to climb the ladder.
Is this drive the same for men and women?
The source suggests it's generally less intense, on average, for women. While status benefits women too, resources, better prospects for kids, the increase in reproductive output isn't as potentially explosive as for men. A woman's reproduction is biologically limited in ways a high-status man's isn't.
So the payoff for risky status seeking is potentially lower for women, evolutionarily.
That's the reasoning offered, which might contribute to some observed behavioral differences or even cultural stereotypes about ambition.
Is status just about being born with talent? Smarts, looks, strength.
Nature plays a role, yes. Innate talents are partly genetic. But the source highlights nurture and plasticity too, using the fascinating example of serotonin.
The feel-good neurotransmitter.
Right, linked to confidence, sociability. Low levels correlate with impulsivity, anxiety, even aggression. But, and this is a key, serotonin levels aren't fixed. They can change based on social success.
Really? How does that work?
The example given is like a student gets elected club president. That success, that rise in status, can actually boost their serotonin levels, which in turn makes them feel more confident, better able to handle the high status role.
Yow! So success breeds the neurochemistry for more success.
It's just a biological feedback loop. Achieving status helps you physiologically adapt to maintaining that status. It shows we're not just fixed by our genes, there's dynamic adaptation.
Okay, so summing up status. A universal, evolved drive linked to reproduction, especially for males.
Yeah.
Fueled by ambition, shaped by both innate traits and this fascinating psychological plasticity like the serotonin feedback loop.
It shows just how deep that desire for social standing runs.
All right, last big section. Section 6. This one feels a bit paradoxical. Self-perception. Why do we both boast and put ourselves down?
Seems contradictory, right? Why evolve self-deception or negativity? Again, the explanation is strategic, focused on social competition.
Let's start with the positive. Feeling good about yourself. Yes, Isha. The source claims this is self-deception to help us deceive others. How?
Think about how good humans are at spotting lies. Conscious deception is hard work, keeping stories straight, controlling micro-expressions. You might slip up, but if you genuinely believe your own hype, if you're fully convinced you're that good, then your outward confidence, your presentation, it's effortless, natural, convincing.
Because you're not acting. You believe it, making the deception undetectable.
Pretty much. The self-deception makes the other deception more effective.
And the point of that outward deception, the boasting, is social competition, building reputation.
Exactly. Making yourself seem more competent, powerful, trustworthy. It attracts allies, mates, opportunities. It's a tool to get ahead.
But clumsy boasting backfires. Kids do it, but adults learn joints.
Right. We learn through feedback what works. Subtle boasting, indirect praise, aligning with cultural norms. That's often more effective, more credible than just shouting about how great you are.
And we help ourselves by twisting reality, especially ambiguous situations.
That's a key bias mention. We tend to attribute our successes to internal factors, skill, effort, and our failures to external factors, bad luck, others' fault, the weather. Even with random stuff like lottery wins, we find ways to claim foresight.
And blaming luck for my failure also subtly questions my rival's success.
It can. If my failure was just bad luck, maybe your success was too, not necessarily superior skill, undermines them without direct confrontation.
Okay, that covers the self-boosting side. What about the opposite? Self-deprecation? Yo, why do that?
Several potential evolutionary functions, according to the source. One is it can actually boost the credibility of your rare self-praise.
How so?
If you're usually humble or self-critical, when you do say something positive about yourself, people take it more seriously. They might think, wow, he must really mean it. Or, he's probably downplaying even more achievements.
Banking credibility by being humble most of the time makes sense. What else?
Safety. In hierarchies, appearing weak or unassuming can make you seem less threatening to those above you. avoids conflict, challenges, being targeted. It's useful when displaying strength is dangerous.
Okay, and another function.
Self-correction. Feeling genuinely bad after a mistake. I'm useless. That painful feeling reinforces the lesson. Makes you less likely to repeat the error, preventing future status drops. It's harsh self-education.
What about chronic pessimism? That just seems bad.
Counterintuitively, maybe not always, if you keep failing at unrealistic goals, Antonelli, persistent pessimism about those goals might encourage you to finally give up on them.
And focus energy elsewhere.
Exactly. Frees up resources to pursue something more achievable where you might actually succeed. It's a painful but potentially adaptive redirection.
So this last section argues our self-perceptions, both positive and negative, are evolved tools. Self-deception aids boasting. Boasting builds reputation. Self-deprecation boosts credibility, ensures safety, aids learning, and helps redirect effort. All strategies for social navigation.
Exactly. Our inner world, our self-image, shaped by the pressures of living and competing with other humans.
Okay, wow. We've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive looking at evolutionary psychology through this summary of the moral animal. We've touched on mating and love, the logic behind preferences,
The surprising evolutionary case for monogamy benefiting the majority.
kinship, altruism through shared genes, parental biases,
Friendship as reciprocal exchange, driven by emotions like gratitude.
the relentless drive for status and how it connects to reproduction and even our brain chemistry.
And finally, how even our self-image, boasting, and self-doubt might be strategic tools for social life.
The core message seems to be looking at the basis or tendencies behind behavior, rooted in that historical drive for gene propagation.
That's the framework, yes. Analyzing the potential evolutionary underpinnings.
But, and this is really crucial, the source itself emphasizes this isn't the whole picture, right?
Absolutely not. This perspective doesn't mean we're just robots controlled by genes. It doesn't deny consciousness, culture, learning, or high-minded qualities.
Human behavior is way more complex. Culture, morals, conscious choice, our flexible brains, they all play huge roles.
Exactly. Evolutionary psychology offers insights into our predispositions, the foundational layer perhaps, but not a complete explanation for everything we do or value. We operate within social norms and our own chosen ethics too.
So for you, the learner listening to this, what does it all mean as you go about your life?
Well, you might consider how many daily interactions, choosing partners, dealing with family, navigating friendships or office politics, even managing your own self-esteem might have these subtle echoes. These ancient, evolved tendencies operating beneath conscious thought and cultural rules.
It definitely raises a fascinating question. As you navigate your own life, how much is driven by these deep-seated evolutionary whispers, and how much by the conscious values and choices you strive to live by? How do you even tell the difference?
That's something to really mull over, isn't it?